The late-night taxi. It was almost 2 a.m. when Jake finally gave up on waiting for his rideshare. The app kept glitching, no drivers available. The streets deserted, except for the occasional flicker of headlights passing in the distance. The bar had closed an hour ago, and the cold night air was starting to bite through his jacket. He swore under his breath, debating whether to start walking the 5 miles home when he saw it. A taxi, an actual old-school yellow cab, pulling up to the curb as if summoned. The back window was tinted too dark to see inside, and the driver, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard, gestured for him to get in. Jake hesitated. He hadn't seen a single cab all night, not even in the city. It was like they'd vanished in the era of rideshares. But the alternative was walking alone through unfamiliar streets in the freezing dark. He pulled the door open and slid inside. The interior smelled strange, not bad, not dirty, just wrong. Like something chemical, something stale. The seats were old, cracked leather, the kind that stuck to your skin. The driver didn't say a word, just started driving as soon as the door shut, the meter dark, no GPS visible. Hey, I'm heading to Maplewood, Jake said, but the driver didn't respond, just kept going, slow and steady. The only sound, the faint hum of the tires on the road. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. "You hear me?" Jake asked again, leaning forward slightly. The driver finally nodded, just once. The motion was slow, mechanical. Jake sat back, unease creeping up his spine. Something was off. The streetlights outside flickered as they passed, casting brief glimpses of the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror, but every time Jake tried to focus on it, it was like his eyes refused to make sense of what he was seeing. The man's face was blurred, not out of focus, not a trick of the light, just wrong, like looking at something his brain refused to process. His hands, though, were clear, pale, too pale. The skin looked stretched, the knuckles sharp beneath the surface, fingers too long, gripping the wheel in a way that made Jake's stomach twist. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the growing panic. Maybe the guy was just weird. Maybe it was just exhaustion messing with his head. But then he noticed the streets. They weren't familiar. He had taken this route 100 times before, but the buildings outside looked different. Darker, older, like a version of the city that had been left behind, abandoned. The signs were blank, the intersections unfamiliar. "Hey, this isn't the way to Maplewood," Jake said, his voice tighter now. The driver didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge him. Jake's heart rate picked up. "Hey, where the hell are we going?" Nothing. The driver's fingers just tightened on the wheel. The air in the cab felt heavier now, thick like static before a storm. Jake reached for his phone, but the screen was black. Not dead, just black, as if it had never been turned on in the first place. No buttons worked, no response, nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Stop the car." The driver didn't. "Stop the goddamn car," Jake shouted, reaching forward to grab the man's shoulder, but the second his fingers touched the fabric of the driver's coat, a wave of nausea hit him so hard he reeled back. The fabric was cold, too cold, like touching metal left out in the winter, and beneath it, there was no give, no flesh, no bone, just something solid, unmoving. The driver's head turned, just slightly, just enough for Jake to see the reflection in the mirror again. This time, he understood why his brain had refused to register the face before. Because there wasn't one. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just a smooth, pale surface where a human face should have been. Jake's breath hitched, his body frozen in pure animal terror. The driver kept turning, the motion too slow, too deliberate. Jake fumbled with the door handle, yanking it hard, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. He slammed his shoulder against the door, his voice rising in panic. "Let me out! Let me out!" The driver didn't blink, didn't move. The cab was still moving, but now the world outside had changed. The streets were gone. The city was gone. Outside the windows was only darkness, stretching infinitely in all directions. No buildings, no lights, no road beneath them, just an endless, suffocating void. The cab was floating, or falling. Jake couldn't tell anymore. His screams died in his throat as his mind buckled under the impossibility of it. His body felt weightless, disconnected. The driver finally spoke. The voice didn't come from his mouth, he had none, but from all around him, inside him, vibrating through his bones. "You called." The words were wrong, layered, echoing like they came from 1,000 voices at once. "You needed a ride." Jake's vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the driver reaching toward him with those long, pale fingers, stretching wider than they should, wrapping around him, pulling him forward into the seat beside him. Jake never made it home that night, and in the city the bar would soon close again. Another man would step outside into the cold, looking for a way home. And somewhere, down a quiet, empty street, a lone taxi would pull up to the curb, waiting. The dog walker's burden. At first it was just feelings, a slight tug of emotion whenever she was near a dog, as if their moods were bleeding into her own. Sadness, excitement, hunger, loneliness. It was subtle, ignorable, even amusing. But then the images started. Flickers at first, brief flashes of thought that weren't her own. She'd be walking a golden retriever when, suddenly, she'd see an image of its owner sitting alone in a dark apartment, head in their hands. Surrounded by unpaid bills, a dachshund would pull on its leash, and she'd see a vision of the dog staring longingly at the female Labrador in the neighboring yard, its simple desires so pure and human-like that it made her laugh. But soon, the visions changed. Darker things crept in. She walked a small terrier whose mind screamed in images of locked cupboards filled with empty pill bottles, of its owner lying motionless on the bathroom floor, breath slow, face slack. A German shepherd sent flashes of its owner, coughing violently into a sink, pink-tinged water swirling down the drain. Cancer, the word formed in her mind, clear as spoken language. The worst were the violent ones. A pit bull, normally playful and gentle, filled her mind with flashes of shadows moving in the night, of a belt snapping across fur and flesh, of small hands flinching away from an unseen figure. A golden retriever, its wagging tail betraying nothing, showed her a little girl hiding in a closet, trembling, while her father raged outside, slamming fists against the door. She stopped taking certain clients after that. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She was just a dog walker. She wasn't a cop, wasn't a social worker. But the visions never stopped. She didn't have to be near the dogs anymore. The images came in the middle of the night, unbidden, in dreams and waking flashes. She'd be pouring coffee and suddenly see a woman she didn't know sobbing in her car, gripping a pregnancy test with shaking hands. She'd be locking up for the night and feel a wave of nausea as she saw a man she'd passed once on the street tying a noose in his basement. And then the disappearances started. It was a husky that first showed her. The image hit her like a truck, its owner in a dimly lit room, tied to a chair, eyes wide with terror, mouth stuffed with cloth, a shadow moving in the background, something sharp glinting in their hand. She jolted out of the vision, breathless, and checked her phone. A news alert. A local woman had gone missing. The husky's owner. The police had no leads. The next day, another image from another dog, a man being shoved into the trunk of a car, hands bound, tears streaming down his face. Another missing person, announced that night. She tried to tell someone, but how could she explain? How could she walk into a police station and say, "Your missing persons cases, I saw them through a beagle's eyes." They'd lock her up. She was sure of it. So she did nothing, until the day the Doberman showed her the worst vision yet, a basement. Concrete walls stained dark, chains bolted into the floor, a row of bodies, some moving, some very still, and a face she recognized. A man she'd seen before, passing by in the park, walking his dog like any normal person. He smiled in the vision, and then he turned, as if he knew she was watching, as if he could see her too. She stopped walking dogs after that, moved to a different city, changed her number. But sometimes in the middle of the night, she still sees the faces, still feels the pull of their thoughts whispering just at the edge of her mind, and she wonders if somewhere out there they can still feel her. The vendor in the park. It started as a rumor, whispered among the late-night wanderers and insomniacs who found themselves drawn to the old park after midnight. The food cart, small and unremarkable by day, transformed into something else entirely when the sun dipped below the horizon. Those who had tried it just once swore by it with a passion bordering on obsession. The vendor, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a perpetual unsettling smile, served only one thing: deluxe nacho chips smothered in steaming rich cheese sauce and layered with the most succulent, perfectly spiced meat. It wasn't just food, they said. It was something more, something divine, something that filled you in a way nothing else could. At first, it seemed harmless, a guilty pleasure, a rare indulgence. But soon, people stopped coming to the park for anything else. They stopped jogging. They stopped walking their dogs. They stopped gathering with friends. They came only for the nachos. They came every night, waiting with feverish anticipation for the cart to appear. And it always did, exactly at midnight, the dim yellow light flickering above it like a moth's wing. The vendor's smile never fading as he handed over tray after tray. But then, they stopped leaving. They would eat and eat and eat, never speaking, never looking away from their meal. Some would sit on the cold benches until dawn, licking the last of the cheese from their fingers with glassy, unseeing eyes. Some would weep as they ate, their bodies shaking with relief and terror. Others would sit silently, chewing, swallowing, chewing again, as if in a trance. And then the disappearances began. The first to go missing was a man named Elliot, a habitual insomniac who had raved about the nachos to anyone who would listen. One night, he had been seen hunched over a tray, his fingers digging greedily into the meat and cheese. The next morning, his car was still in the lot. His phone, his wallet, his keys, untouched. There was no sign of him. Then came Marcy, a woman who worked the graveyard shift at the gas station down the street. She was last seen shoveling nachos into her mouth with a look of something close to ecstasy, her hands trembling as she ate. She was never seen again. More followed. People who had never met before, never interacted, but all shared the same insatiable need. The park became a place of fear. No one spoke of the disappearances, not openly, but they all felt it, a heavy, suffocating dread. And yet they kept coming. They couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. Some tried. Some swore they would never eat them again, that they would break free from whatever spell had been cast over them. They lasted a day, maybe two. Then they were back, more desperate than before, their faces hollow, their eyes bloodshot, their hands twitching as they shoved the food into their mouths with frantic, animalistic hunger. One man was seen on his knees, sobbing as he devoured the chips, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his lips torn from biting too hard. It was a hunger beyond reason, a craving deeper than addiction. It was a force, an inevitability, and those who indulged too much simply ceased to exist. No bodies were found, no screams were heard. They were just gone, erased from reality itself. The vendor never acknowledged it. He never spoke of the missing. He only smiled, his fingers delicately arranging each tray as if performing a sacred ritual. And still they came, and still they ate. And those who resisted knew, deep in the marrow of their bones, that it would only be a matter of time before they too would find themselves standing in that line, waiting in the cold, eyes wide, stomachs aching, mouths watering, knowing full well the price they would pay, and yet unable to resist. The chalk prophet. It started as an oddity, a street artist who worked in chalk, appearing overnight in different parts of the city. His work was undeniably beautiful, detailed landscapes, surreal portraits, strange symbols, and cryptic phrases scrawled across sidewalks and alleyways. No one ever saw him working, no one knew his name. He would appear only in the remnants of his art, always drawn late at night, washed away within days by rain or footsteps. At first, people dismissed it as just another eccentric artist, someone with talent but no audience, a ghost of the city's forgotten corners. But then, something changed. People began to notice patterns. The drawings seemed familiar. A street scene, for instance, perfectly depicted the aftermath of a traffic accident that hadn't happened yet. A mural of storm clouds and fractured buildings appeared 3 days before an earthquake rattled the downtown district. Faces drawn in exquisite detail were later found to be exact matches of people reported missing. The artist, it seemed, wasn't just drawing, he was predicting. At first, the media treated it as an urban legend, something easily fabricated by coincidence and mass hysteria. But then came the stock market sketches. In the financial district, just outside a popular cafe, the artist scrawled the name of an obscure company and a jagged arrow pointing straight up. Within a week, the company's stock soared beyond reason, an unprecedented surge that defied logic. Investors who noticed the sketch and acted on it made fortunes. The next week, another name, another symbol, another skyrocketing stock. It became impossible to ignore. The government, the press, corporate elites all wanted to know who was behind the drawings. But the artist never showed himself, never left a trace. Cameras placed in areas where he was known to work mysteriously malfunctioned, or captured only an empty sidewalk until, without explanation, the drawings would simply be there. People started to worship him. They called him the Chalk Prophet. They searched the city, trying to catch him in the act, hoping to decipher the method behind his foresight. Some wanted answers, some wanted money, some just wanted to know how he knew. And then the messages became darker. A series of unsettling images appeared one morning on the steps of City Hall. An old clock with the hands twisted backward, a skyline consumed by smoke, faceless people kneeling in rows, their shadows stretching unnaturally long behind them. The words 3 days were scratched beneath it in hurried, uneven letters. The city braced for disaster. The media scrambled. Officials downplayed the panic, but fear spread like wildfire. And then, on the 3rd day, the largest cyber attack in history crippled the nation, wiping bank accounts, disrupting hospitals, collapsing infrastructure. The Chalk Prophet had known. He had warned them. After that, his work became less frequent but more ominous. Sketches of missing people would include dates that marked the exact moment their bodies were found. Political scandals were drawn in surreal, nightmarish compositions weeks before they unraveled in reality. It was no longer a question of if his predictions would come true, only when. People started going mad over it. Some spent their nights obsessively hunting the next drawing, desperate for a glimpse into their future. Others went into hiding, terrified of seeing their own face sketched in chalk. Those who had once profited from his stock tips now refused to touch them, knowing that for every gain there was a cost. No one could understand what he wanted, why he was doing this, if he was even human at all. And then one morning, without explanation, all his work disappeared. Not washed away, not covered up, gone. Every drawing, every symbol, every word, erased, as if he had never existed. The city waited for another message, another warning, another clue. But it never came. The Chalk Prophet had vanished. And for the first time, people were left with something far more terrifying than his predictions: silence.